So a really warm welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Adam Humphreys. I'm the head of the Department of Politics and International Relations here at the University of Reading. Really warm welcome. Thank you for coming tonight. This is the first Political Voices event we've been able to run for nearly 2 years, so it is really fantastic to be back and to see you all here in person and with such a distinguished guest speaker. Thank you. The format's going to be very simple. Talk for about 40 minutes, up to about 40 minutes, and then plenty of time for questions, thoughts, contributions from the floor. Before we introduce the speaker, I thought I might just comment on why this is the Peter Campbell lecture. Peter Campbell, I have found out, was the founding head of the Department of Politics here at the University of Reading back in 1964 and was the driving force behind its subsequent growth. He was an expert on French politics. He was also, for over 30 years, co-chair of the Reading University Conservative Association. He was a vice president of the Electoral Reform Society, and in 1975 founded the Conservative Group for Homosexual Equality. He died in 2005, and a memorial fund now supports a series of annual lectures, this is this year's, and also very importantly, provides a prize fund for prizes for students who've made outstanding contributions to the life of the department, which are given out at graduation each year. So this is this year's annual Peter Campbell lecture. So turning now to tonight's guest speaker. So Oliver Letwin is an eminent former MP, cabinet minister, who played an influential behind-the-scenes role in the 2010 coalition government under David Cameron, and was also a key figure in the attempts by parliamentarians of all parties to avoid a so-called no-deal Brexit back in 2019. He was MP for West Dorset from 1997 to 2019, held a variety of high-profile positions, including Shadow Home Secretary, Shadow Chancellor, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. And although it was a less publicly prominent role, I hope you won't mind me saying that I think your best title's got to be Minister for Government Policy. That's a really excellent title. Unusually for a politician, Sir Oliver holds a PhD in philosophy, and from the University of Cambridge, no less. He's currently visiting professor here at the University of Reading in the Department for Politics and International Relations. We're really thrilled to have you here tonight to talk on the topic of reason and unreason in politics.
Thank you very much. I should begin this by saying that if anybody thinks that they're about to hear a sort of political speech and that's what they wanted to come and hear, they should quietly leave because this isn't one. You'll see that that it has a relationship to politics as it currently is, but I've tried in writing this to exercise some demons and sort out in my mind something that was worrying me. And if it doesn't worry you, then please go to sleep quietly. And I apologize. 60 years ago, when Michael Oakeshott published his famous essay on rationalism in politics, the isms were not yet wasms. In that now quaintly distant world, the horrors of Nazism had only recently been defeated. The disasters of Soviet and Maoist Marxism were still being visited on hundreds of millions of people behind the Iron Curtain. British industry was the scene of industrial warfare between socialism and capitalism. In short, politics and geopolitics were under the sway of battling theories, each of which purported to deliver right answers to political problems. It was against these rationalist theories and theorists that Oakeshott took aim. Like Karl Popper and Isaiah Berlin, though in a different idiom and deploying different arguments, Oakeshott sought to demolish the scientific pretension of the isms by exposing the theoretical inadequacy of all pseudoscientific political theorizing from Platonism to Marxism. Alongside this creative destruction, his positive intent was to restore the intellectual respectability of practical reasoning, recognized by Aristotle as the proper mode of moral and political life, but despised by the pseudoscientific theorists of right and left. He accordingly characterized truly rational political discourse as an unending, non-theoretical conversation about the practical wisdom of political action, the continuing effort to keep the ship of state afloat on a stormy sea. Much has changed since the early 1960s, not least the virtual disappearance of the 19th and 20th century rationalist isms from politics and geopolitics. The propagation of high theory purporting to deliver political truth has become, for the time being at least, a niche activity restricted to a few eccentrics. The far right has abandoned all claim to a theoretical base. Mainstream Marxism, though nominally preserved in China, has in fact become so thoroughly infected by state capitalism as to be radically anti-Marxist. European socialism has become so impregnated by market economics as to be radically anti-socialist. And what used to be thought of as free market governing parties throughout the so-called capitalist world, even if subject to liberal democratic constraints unknown to the Chinese, are now sponsoring state intervention of a kind that is often difficult to distinguish from the Chinese economic model. In short, we no longer stand in imminent danger of barbarism engendered by theory. Instead, we face a new danger, the danger of barbarism engendered by barbarity, bizarrely supported by the wilder excesses of critical thought. The enemy of rationality in today's politics is not rationalism, but unreason, not high theory, but low populism, not the pretensions of pseudoscience, but a blithe disregard for, or even disbelief in, every form of science and every form of fact. Today's political irrationality invokes categories which didn't enter Oakeshott's vocabulary: alternative facts, his or her truth, post-truth. We are threatened 40 years on with the triumph not of misguided ideologies, but of Orwell's fantasies for 1984, newspeak and doublethink. The possibility that a politician might be taken seriously when announcing that reality is perception, or that disease is health, or that war is peace, no longer seems remote. The political isms against which Oakeshott and Popper and Berlin so nobly struggled in the post-war years came at a high cost to humanity. But there's no guarantee that the cost to humanity of today's unreason in politics will be any lower. In particular, unreason is a deadly enemy of liberal democracy, attacking it in three ways. The first attack consists in the destruction of the form of conversation required to sustain a liberal democracy. Where contestants in the political debate abandon adherence to the requirement for reasoned argument and verified assertion, the debate descends into a mere shouting match. The second attack consists in the destruction of the ability of liberal democracy to deliver good government. Where the debate becomes nothing better than a shouting match, the winner is he or she who shouts loudest, rather than he or she who will govern best. The third attack consists in the destruction of faith in the institutions of a liberal democracy. Seeing the debate descend into a shouting match and the participants becoming nothing better than rival noisemakers, sensible citizens begin to question the value of liberal democracy and become increasingly attracted to rule by technocrats or high-minded oligarchs. For those of us who are attached to liberal democracy as a form of social organization, these effects of unreason in politics are concerning. We therefore need to defend reason in politics. We need to re-establish the value of intellectual honesty, truth, and fact as the hallmarks of proper political conversation. But these propositions are not self-evident. Once challenged, they require to be defended by re-establishing that there are facts, that there is truth, and that politics should not be divorced from them. Wittgenstein, whose philosophizing shares much more with Oakeshott's than is commonly supposed, begins his Tractatus with the immortal line, "The world is all that is the case," and then expands this into the statement that the world is the totality of facts, not things. Taken together, these statements constitute an assertion of common sense and a cry of desperation against both skepticism and reductionism. One doesn't need to be a Wittgensteinian of any variety, still less a follower of the early Wittgenstein of the Tractatus, to heed that cry. There is much that is real besides physical things. Words are real, numbers are real, musical notes are real, love and friendship, resentment and disgust, marriage and law are all real. None of these are physical things. But they're facts that populate the world. They can't be wished or dreamed away by skeptics or reduced away by physical reductionism or crude verificationism. Anyone seeking, for example, to deny the reality of words is compelled to issue the denial in words, and hence to convict himself or herself of incoherence. A word is a reality, not an illusion, and it's a reality, a fact, that is not reducible to a physical thing. Likewise, causes and reasons are real. They too cannot be wished or dreamed away by skeptics, or reduced away by physical reductionism or crude verificationism. And they operate at many interlocking levels of reality. Scientists are very used to such levels of causal reality. Medics identify causes of change at the level of human life. Biologists and microbiologists identify causes of change at the level of cells and molecules. Chemists and physicists identify causes of change at the level of atomic and subatomic particles. Causation at one of these levels of reality is not necessarily reducible to causation at some more microscopic or macroscopic level. Physicists do not expect to be able to identify whether someone losing their job has caused them to be anxious about the future, because unlike psychiatrists, physicists do not deal with items such as jobs and anxiety. As Oakeshott would have put it, psychiatry and physics are two equally valid but distinct modes of experience which yield distinct causal accounts because they deal with distinct aspects of the world. This is not, of course, to suggest that anxiety about the future or losing a job are supernatural things. It's rather to say that, though they will have physical correlates aplenty, they are not things at all. But they are nevertheless facts in the world, realities as real as any thing. They may be related by a causality that is cognitive, depending on meaning rather than physical, but which is nonetheless real for that. The loss of a job is real, anxiety about the future is real, one may perhaps cause the other, but the chain of causation cannot be grasped without understanding the significance, the meaning of losing a job. To understand why the neurological events associated with the anxiety are occurring, you need to understand the cognitive significance of the event that has occurred. Hence, what is explicable and causative at one level of reality may be random and inexplicable at another level of reality. So we live in a world of facts, of realities, but also in a world composed of many levels and kinds of reality, which cannot necessarily be reduced into one another. And just as there are many different valid ways of connecting real things, so there are many different ways in which we use language to describe those things, each of which will have its own particular test of validity. If we want to understand the relationship between politics or political language and reality, we therefore need to understand what is the appropriate test of validity for political language. In the case of some forms of abstraction, inquiries into truthfulness constitute merely an elaborate kind of joke. A tune, for example, is an abstraction, but inquiring into its truthfulness would be as much a category area as asking whether green ideas sleep furiously. We may ask whether the tune is beautiful, but we cannot ask seriously whether it's true or untrue, unless, of course, there are exceptional circumstances such as it being or being suspected of being a coded message. A map, by contrast, is a form of abstraction about whose accuracy or truthfulness we may well inquire, because the point of a map is to guide action, and it will guide action correctly only if it is accurate. Of course, the test of the truth of a map is not whether all users who act on it achieve what they would under all the circumstances achieve if it were accurate, but rather whether all users who know how to use the map achieve such results. We can take this as a paradigm for those forms of factual abstraction which, like maps, have the purpose of guiding action. The test of the truth of an abstraction intended to guide action is whether actors who know how to use the abstraction and whose acts are guided by it achieve what, under all the circumstances, they would achieve if it were true. This is, of course, epistemologically complicated because it's difficult to know all of the relevant circumstances. There's always a chance the outcome has occurred for some reason other than the action prompted by the belief, and so on and so forth. But the foundational point remains after all the complexities are acknowledged. Factual abstractions intended to guide action are true if they can be used to navigate the world in the way that the factual abstraction would lead a competent user to expect. Logic, mathematics, and philosophical reasoning may enable abstractions to be tested in a different way, for internal coherence or for consistency with other abstractions known or believed to be true. The propositions of logic, mathematics, and fundamental philosophy are abstractions at the highest possible level. They're tools or rules for constructing, tidying up, or characterizing other high-level abstractions, or for understanding how they themselves or those other abstractions function, the very activity in which we're currently engaged. They are, in this sense, procedural. Taken together, such higher level of abstractions form a complex web of procedures and procedural rules and observations about procedures and procedural rules. Within this web, procedures, procedural rules, and observations may themselves be tested and modified by one another. In all of these transactions, coherence and consistency are the only tests of validity. But the ultimate test of the validity of the whole procedural, i.e., logical, mathematical, and philosophical web, is whether the everyday factual abstractions, constructed, modified, or validated using the procedures within the web, lead to actions that work in the world. Hence the relationship between mathematics, physics, engineering, bridge building, and bridges that last or fall down. It would not be wise to travel across a bridge constructed by an engineer who believes that alternative mathematics will do just as well as the real thing. However, when we turn from factual abstractions to propositions about moral or aesthetic value, the situation is fundamentally different. Meta-ethical theories and analytical ethical theories are forms of philosophy. They may lead to the revision of moralities, but they do not in themselves constitute moralities and don't in themselves constitute recommendations for action. Accordingly, as with the rest of philosophy, the test of their validity is only internal coherence or consistency. But by contrast, normative moral theories and specific moral injunctions pass beyond the analytical. Instead of being offered purely as dispassionate analyses, they make recommendations for action, as with a map, but with a crucial difference. Unlike the map, which is offered as a hypothetical guide to action, if you want to get to B, starting from A, go this way, normative moral theories and specific moral injunctions recommend courses of action which are intended to be categorical rather than hypothetical. Go this way because it's the right thing to do. Hence, even when they present the appearance of theory rather than practice, their underlying structure is that of categorical imperatives governing or purporting to govern action. Manifestly, moral assertions, even when they're in this sense guides to action, cannot be validated in the same way as a map on the basis of whether they work in the world. One cannot sensibly ask, if I act in accordance with this morality, will I achieve what I would achieve if the morality were true? Because one can't identify anything that one would achieve if one were to follow the morality other than having followed the morality. If I act in accordance with the belief system that constitutes a particular morality, i.e. in accordance with the commands of that belief system that are categorical, there's nothing in the world against which to check the accuracy of my belief. The hypothesis presented by a map, if you want to go from A to B, follow this route, can be checked and validated or invalidated. Categorical imperatives can only be obeyed or disobeyed. If my morality commands me to walk into the flames of a martyr's death, I can sensibly, albeit rather painfully, ask as I burn, whether my abstract factual belief that the flames would burn me if I walked into them has been borne out by acting on it. But nothing about the fact that the flames are burning me will tell me whether I was right to act on the command. This is the familiar fact-value distinction, or the familiar aversion to the naturalistic fallacy, represented in a slightly different idiom. But maybe moralities can be subject to a different form of working in the world test. It seems clear that a morality can be self-defeating in the world. For example, a morality that lacks concepts of trust and honesty will ultimately prevent its exponents from cooperating successfully. A morality may also be self-contradictory, involving two or more judgments that can't rationally be made together. It may, in other words, contain or depend upon logical procedural deficiencies. Or a morality may in some way depend on factual propositions that are testably false, i.e. that if acted upon by an actor who understood them would not reliably lead to the results that would occur if they were true. For example, a morality based on false claims about differences between people of different ethnicities or genders. In cases like these, appeals to change a moral practice may be made and may succeed. Such appeals are either factual or procedural in character. They may take the form either of pointing to an incoherence or of pointing to a factually mistaken belief. Either change the practice because it doesn't cohere with the moral beliefs that you hold more dear, or change the practice because it's having an effect of which you hadn't been factually aware. Once subject to appeals of this kind, a particular moral belief system may be unable to sustain itself in the face of alternates. This may happen suddenly or only over a long time. There may be moralities that subsist alongside one another for long periods, during which they aren't in any evident way plagued by procedural defects or false factual presumptions, and may yet eventually be subject to forms of appeal that lead their adherents to modify or abandon them, due to the belated recognition of procedural defects or to the belated discovery of factual errors. Unlike moralities, political settlements may alter over time without any of these defects or errors having become apparent, simply because those who have previously accepted them decide they're no longer tolerable. Such revised views of what constitute tolerable forms of social life are indeed the normal reasons for changes in political belief systems. The principal test we apply to the validity of a political appeal is whether the form of life thought likely to arise from heeding the appeal is judged likely to be more satisfactory than the current situation in some sufficiently important respect to merit change. It follows that, within any political community at any one time, an appeal for change, unless compelled by the discovery of a logical defect or a false factual presumption, needs to proceed by persuading those whose view we hope to change that the change in question will deliver a form of life which will be judged more satisfactory. The anchor here is the preconceptions of those we hope to change. We have to persuade them that a particular political change will lead to a form of life they already conceive to be superior to their current form of life in some respect. If acting upon such recommendations for change in political practice does indeed lead to a form of life considered ex post to be more satisfactory, then the recommendation for political change is in that specific sense validated. But this validation does not establish the recommendation as a political fact. It is merely a contingent approval. It lasts only for as long as the forms of life arising from actions undertaken in conformity with the recommendations contained in the appeal continue to be regarded as satisfactory by the relevant political community. Of course, such political appeals or recommendations are complex items. They frequently amalgamate factual propositions, prudential recommendations, and moral recommendations. Their origins, the states of mind from which they spring, are also complex. These may include factual beliefs, prudential desires, moral beliefs, emotional responses, psychological needs, creative impulses, and so on. Disentangling such elements and motivations from one another in order to discern the true nature and true origin of a particular political appeal is accordingly a complex act of discovery. The complexity of the amalgamations within and behind a political appeal and the consequent complexity of the act of disentanglement typically makes it impossible to understand the nature of the appeal without also understanding a considerable amount about the political actor making it and about the context within which it's being made. A political appeal, as opposed to an administrative command, is likely to have, or at least to be presented as having, the form of a practical syllogism. Do X, because if you do X, it will lead to Y, and you desire Y. But such an appeal made by a particular political actor in a particular setting may, beneath the surface, have the form of an importantly different practical syllogism. Do X, because if you do X, it will lead to Y, and I desire Y. In political appeals, which contain practical syllogisms dependent only on factual observations rather than social recommendations, the tests of validity are tests of truth, tests of whether the factual observation works in the world. This may, of course, in a given case be very difficult to establish due to the complexity of the world, the need for time to tell whether hypotheticals come true in the world, the difficulty of obtaining evidence, and so forth. In political appeals which contain practical syllogisms dependent on both factual propositions and social recommendations, both types of validation, tests of factual truth and observations about the satisfactory or unsatisfactory nature of likely ex post effects on forms of communal political life, are required. The task of achieving such complex validation, even assuming that the practical syllogisms inherent in the political appeal have been successfully disentangled, may be arduous and lengthy. In practice, there is rarely time to conduct such validation before a decision is made about whether to accept or reject a given political appeal. Hence, this idealized rational approach to disentanglement and validation is seldom applied. It's not how politics in any system, regime, time, or place tends to work in practice. The actual mechanics of political appeals at most times and in most places depend instead on brand, identity, trust, hope, and fear. The political message becomes wholly entwined in the messenger. The purpose of political communication is not so much to persuade the listener of the validity of a set of propositions as to establish a certain relationship between the listener and the communicator. I am the sort of person you are, or at least the sort of person with whom you can identify yourself, therefore you can trust me, therefore you don't need to inquire too far into the validity of my arguments or the evidence of my assertions. The fact that they're my arguments and my assertions is enough to make them your truth. Great political movements, effective political alliances, enduring political affiliations are formed on the basis of such emotionally powerful but intellectually fragile appeals. The leaders of such movements become the embodiments of brands trusted by followers. The followers follow the leaders, not because of any analytical subscription, but because the leaders have the emotional intelligence to establish the brand, to communicate the identity, to generate the trust, and hence to play on the fears or encourage the hopes of the followers. It's out of this repeated and inevitable dynamic that unreason in politics is born. In the politics of unreason, the medium, the appeal of the brand, the appeal to trust, becomes the message itself, rather than merely the means by which the message acquires political traction. The political process ceases to be based on arduous efforts by the leaders to disentangle the practical syllogisms of responsible government. The leaders themselves cease to be guided by coherent, reasoned argument and evidenced assertions. The debate, even at the highest and most refined levels, ceases to subject factual assertions to tests of truth and ceases to consider seriously whether given political recommendations are likely to lead to a form of life that will be considered ex post to be more satisfactory. In place of such careful analysis come sectarian requirements for loyalty to the brand, unquestioning implementation of the dictates of the leadership, the deadly consequences of dangerous populism and political correctness, to the point where the mechanism of political appeal has poisoned the body politic. What is the protection against such unreason in politics? Is there a bulwark that can be established? Is there a guarantee that can be constructed? Sadly, the answer is that there can be no such external protection or bulwark or guarantee. The threat of the medium becoming the message, the threat that the leaders themselves will abandon the careful analysis required to disentangle the complex practical syllogisms of responsible government is ever present. No constitutional system, no legal system, no political system can achieve immunity to these dangers because leaders who are unconstrained by the need for valid argument and verified assertion will tend also to be unconstrained by such systems of protection. In the terms so notably coined by Oakeshott, the observance by leaders of adverbial constraints is conditional on those leaders at least intuitively subscribing to the practical syllogisms which justify the adverbial constraints. From the moment when the leaders abandon concern with the validity of the practical syllogisms they are purveying, they will tend to abandon also the concern that they might otherwise have for the constitutional apparatus that establishes adverbial constraints on their actions. Indeed, once they set out on this path, it can all too easily lead them to regard that constitutional apparatus itself as an intolerable constraint on their freedom of action. In the populist and politically correct worlds of alternative facts, the adverbial constraints and the means by which they are normally enforced, the judges, the legislature, the law itself, come to be seen, at least potentially, as enemies of the people. If there is no set of institutions that can be relied upon to protect us from unreason in politics, who or what can provide us with reason in politics? The only answer is our politicians. Reason governs politics if, but only if, the leaders who lead are themselves governed by reason. To be effective, to gain traction, those leaders need, of course, to understand the medium. They need to have the emotional intelligence to make political appeals that work rhetorically by appealing to brand, trust, and identity. But they need also, as a matter of character, to have the intellectual honesty to ensure that the messages they convey are based upon serious understanding of the practical syllogisms of responsible government, and hence on reasoned argument and verified factual assertions. If political debate though inevitably carried into the wider public arena through the medium of brand, trust, and identity, is conducted at the highest levels with such intellectual honesty on all sides, then reason in politics will prevail. Contingent resolutions will give way gracefully to other contingent resolutions as the ex post validity or invalidity of given practical syllogisms comes to light. But if political debate lacks such intellectual honesty, if the leaders of the debate themselves abandon adherence to reasoned argument and verified factual assertion, unreasoned politics will prevail, and no system will save us from it. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Such a thought-provoking talk. Now, I think that we've got a couple of microphones, well, I can't see where they are. Oh, Rose has got one. So, is this the point at which we turn to the audience for questions, thoughts, comments, observations, provocations? Anyone would like to start us off? Yeah, at the back.
Thank you. It's a bit of a long question. Most schools of sociology, amongst them Marxism, identify the breakdown of organic bonds of trust, social cohesion, and on the other hand, increasing relative inequality, social atomization, and lastly, alienation as a key fundamental catalyst for instability and radical transformation of the structures. Is this not the current trajectory of Western liberal democracies? First, and second, what would you say are the current policies aimed at enabling social resilience, specifically in the context of a global Britain in a rapidly changing world? Thank you.
Gosh, this is quite a big question, which I shan't try to answer all of. But let me take one aspect of it. I think it's true that when large sections of a population come to feel alienated from the actions which are being taken in their name, that creates a profound instability of the kind you're describing. Before I go on, I should say, I think it's very normal for that to be the case. If you look at long stretches of history as opposed to short stretches, I think what you see is very, very long periods in which large sections of populations are alienated or feel alienated from what's being done to them or over them. And quite short periods during which there's, in any particular country or political establishment, anything approximating to real solidarity in the population as a whole, and a real feeling of being somehow or other governed in the way that they wish to be governed. And the second thing I want to say before coming back to the main part of the answer is that where people do feel solidarity, or rather where very large parts of the population feel solidarity, very typically does not conform to what those of us who treasure a liberal democracy would like to feel. There is an enormous amount of evidence, I think to the point of near incontrovertibility, that although there are, of course, many, many people in absolute numbers in China who are very disenchanted with the current system, actually, in terms of percentages, the overwhelming bulk of the Chinese people at the moment feel, if you ask them questions like, is China going in the right direction? They feel it is. They feel intense social solidarity. They feel that the government and the system is looking after their interests. And there are reasons for this. And they have to do with the rapid and sustained, huge advance of material prosperity compared with an earlier age. And indeed, actually, the improvement of other conditions of life compared with the experience of people now living and of people whose parents and grandparents went through great traumas in earlier years. And yet, of course, China is not governed by a system that many of us would like to live under ourselves. And I think actually the feeling of solidarity and of not being alienated from the system that is governing you very often, for better or worse, has much more to do with the material conditions of life and the feeling of going about one's ordinary business and the ability to do so than it does with higher concepts like liberty or other things which particular people might treasure. So that brings me to an answer to the first part of your question. Is there something radically unstable about systems of liberal democracy that is leading to a sense of alienation and will lead to, therefore, instability? I think translates into the question, can liberal democracy, and whether it should do or not is a different matter, but does actually translate into the question, are liberal democracies capable of continuing to deliver material improvements in people's conditions of life so that people feel that things are heading in the right direction, that their children will be better off than they are, and that they themselves are better off than their parents, and so on. Where better off means slightly more than just literally better off in financial terms, but not that much more. Social and aesthetic considerations and environmental considerations certainly come to bear, but these higher concepts, I think, not much. And most, though not all, of the aesthetic and social and environmental concerns actually have to do, in large measure, with the material, because unless you have a lot of money, it's very difficult in a society to guarantee good aesthetic, social, and environmental circumstances. And I think the challenge, therefore, which Western democracies have recently encountered is not actually, as is often supposed, some deep instability about the idea of democracy or the idea of liberalism or any of the other things that might be supposed. It is rather that some combination, and it may take many decades to get much more sense than we have already of it, but some combination of the very profound technological revolution that we're currently experiencing and the financial crash of 2008 has, I think, led to a very large number of people in liberal democracies feeling deeply alienated because they find their conditions of life either worse or threatened. And I don't think that's because of liberal democracy. I think that's because of the profound technological change and the crash of 2008. And that's an instructive comparison with China, where the financial crash did not occur in the same way, and where, although there's been profound technological change because of the particular relationship to this phase of development in China, it has on the whole advanced rather than retarded the welfare of very, very large numbers of people. So I don't believe that it's the system of government that generates the current degree of alienation. I think it has much more to do with the economic realities. In that sense, so to speak, I'm quite Marxist about it. But I think it's often read the other way, and that I think is an error. I have to say that I don't think that has anything to do with what I was talking about here, because that analysis is either right or wrong, but whether it's right or wrong, there's still an argument of the kind I was trying to make for conducting politics in any system on the basis of reasoned argument and evidence.
Great. Who's next? Wave your hands. I've got one here, one here. So we'll go here first and then here. Wait, just wave again.
Since 1945, has the welfare state replaced the institution of the family? As of 2020, 14% of families are single-parent households.
I think those are two separate questions. Has the welfare state replaced the family? And what is the relationship between the family as a concept and as a reality on the one side, and having two parents at home on the other side? I don't think that the welfare state has replaced the family at all, or could, because the welfare state provides one kind of thing and the family provides another. Incidentally, both provide these things very imperfectly, but nevertheless, they at least seek to provide them, and very often do. The welfare state provides cash for people who don't have enough of it. Families provide love and support and other things which are also an incredibly important part. When I said that there were social considerations that are critical to people's lives, that's what I mean, the love and support of other human beings. And you can't get those out of any system, however brilliantly designed, that is a set of laws and rules and bureaucracies and entitlements. You only get those out of relationships. You can't have a relationship with the welfare state. You can fall foul of it, but you can't be in love with it, and you can't be loved by it, and you can be materially supported by it, but you cannot be emotionally supported by it. You might be emotionally supported by somebody who's working for it, that's a different thing, but by the system as a whole, you can't. Whereas you can be by families, and in fact, that's how people grow up. If they're at all lucky, that's exactly what does happen. So I don't think that the welfare state has or could ever replace the family. They then come to the question, is the statistic you present about the number of families in which there is only one parent some kind of evidence of the kind you imply, though you don't quite say, that the family is sort of disappearing or becoming less important or something of that sort? I don't think it presents any such evidence at all. In the first place, the statistic is wildly misleading. Whatever the number of parents at home does not mean that they're the only adults at home. And in your number are included any number of families in which there are, in fact, two parents at home, and the difference is that one of them is the parent of one child and another is a parent of another child. And it may or may not work, just as any sort of traditional nuclear family may work, but it may work very well indeed. And it's certainly a family by any. I mean, even those who think that families only consist of two parents present, so to speak, they don't have to be the parents of the particular child to count for that purpose. Secondly, I don't think there's any evidence at all. I mean, there are various people who've tried desperately to prove it, but I don't think there's actually any evidence at all that single parents are less good at supporting or loving their children than double parents. There are plenty of parents, alas, of whom there are two, of the one child or of a set of children, who fail in one way or another as parents. God knows, probably we all do in some respects. And no doubt there are single parents who fail, but I don't think there's any evidence that two parents are more likely to fail than single parents, or that single parents are less likely to succeed than dual parents. I mean, it really is quite astonishing how failed the attempts are by those who believe, for one reason or other, maybe religious or otherwise, that you have to have two parents present, to show that the result is of not having two parents is somehow inferior for the child. I don't think there's any evidence of that at all. So my answer to your question is, first of all, the welfare state can't replace the family. Secondly, there's much more family around than your statistic, though true, implies. And third, actually, single parents, where there are single parents, are a family, or can constitute a family, just as well, if they're the right kind of single parent and the right kind of child, as two parents and a child. So I think my answer to your question is pretty comprehensively no.
Thank you. Question here.
So when we saw the abject failure in the United States of President Trump's presidency and the potentially landslide victory for Joe Biden, it looked as if there was a bit of a fall in the West of populism and populist politics. Why in this country do the electorate seem to persist with personality politics in the likes of Boris Johnson, who's a very large character, very loud, very sort of relatable in sort of inverted commas? Why do the electorate seem to persist with relatable characters rather than policies that will actually benefit them?
Well, this is very directly related to what I was talking about. First of all, I don't share your analysis of what happened in the US. There was not a landslide. There was a rather narrow victory for Biden. In fact, really pretty narrow. While I am no admirer of President Trump's policy stances, or indeed his method of conducting politics for the very reasons I describe here, a very, very, very large number of Americans are continue to be enormously enamored by his methods and policies. If anything, many of them seem to have become more passionately enamored by them post the election than they were even before. Indeed, some of them took it into their heads to, admittedly a small, tiny fraction, but nevertheless took it into their heads to storm the Capitol, demonstrating their profound admiration and distaste for the replacement. So I don't think that the United States has given up on populism. We have yet to see what happens next, but it is perfectly possible that President Trump will be the next president. Ex-President Trump will be the next president. I recall an extraordinary time when all my Conservative parliamentary colleagues and I were at a gathering, annual gathering of the parliamentary party, and we had a series of interesting talks by experts, one of whom was an expert on American politics. And this was about 2 years before the election in which President Trump became president, in fact, about 18 months before. And the talk by the expert was about the fact that it was impossible for Trump even to get the nomination, let alone to become president. So every time I hear somebody say that it's quite impossible that he should be president again, I remember this talk. I think it's a very open question whether his day is done or not. So I don't think there's this great contrast that you're drawing between the United States and our own situation so far as the attraction of populism is concerned. And on the other side, I don't think it's yet clear how far populism will triumph here, or indeed in other European countries. My sense is, on the contrary, that what's at stake here is a continuing battle between those who think that populism is the only way you can conduct politics successfully, and therefore what you should do, and that reasoned argument and evidenced assertion are things of the past as far as political debate is concerned. And not just political debate, but the formulation of policy and the conduct of government. And those who think, I'm characterizing both positions, or caricaturing both positions, admittedly, but nevertheless, those who think on the other side that actually less important than immediately achieving your goal is to achieve it in a way which sustains a liberal democracy by sticking by the principles I was describing here. And I think that battle is likely to go on for quite a long time, maybe a very long time, because I don't think there's anything new about it. Anybody here who has seen Shakespeare's Julius Caesar will be aware that this was something well understood in the 16th century. Actually, I think you didn't need Shakespeare. Anybody who looks at the history of the Roman Empire and of the period of the Republic will know that these things were being argued out then too. So this is a very long-running thing. It's a very long-running battle. And I think that the right way to present it is actually that it's a huge achievement to create a political system within which there is room for and encouragement of a kind of politics that does not consist of populism. That seems to me the odd bit. And so sustaining that is a very precious thing, but a very difficult thing. I don't think one ought to ask the question, why have people a tendency to be impressed by effective populism? I think the right thing to ask is, what is it that might enable people, some people, to create a system or sustain a system in which that isn't the only way things are done? Because that's the achievement. Sorry, there was a...
More questions? Yeah.
Sorry. So I wanted to ask about possible routes out of the kind of predicament that you've described. And I think you were quite pessimistic, I think, about the idea there might be institutional solutions to this problem of unreason in politics. And you suggested that we're going to need to look to the character of individual political leaders. In light of that, I just wanted to ask you to say a few words or maybe reflect a bit on a set of possible institutional mechanisms that have been quite popular both in political philosophy in recent years and also I think have had some traction in real politics. So this is the idea that citizens themselves might come together directly in small pockets probably to deliberate, so to consider evidence from experts, to exchange views and perspectives, to come to ideally a more reasoned conclusion and perhaps a set of recommendations or even a decision that could be fed into the wider political process. I'm thinking about things like citizens' juries, deliberative mini-publics, participatory budgeting. And so I was interested in whether this kind of institutional mechanism could play any sort of role in pushing back on this tide of unreason in politics that you've described, or is this kind of hopelessly naive or optimistic?
Well, this is a very, very interesting question. I had a large number of discussions about that very issue with Yvette Cooper when we were both engaged in parliamentary manoeuvres on the Brexit front, because she's a huge proponent of these deliberative mechanisms. And I've been sort of thinking about it ever since as a result. And I think I want to say three things. The first is, I think these mechanisms have, or can have, real value. As you say, they're quite fashionable in theoretical circles, but I think they can have real practical value as well, because actually facing citizens who are typically more intelligent and sensible about things than most people think other people are. I think Descartes once said that the only thing we don't lack in human life is wisdom, because he'd never met anyone who thought they had too little of it. And it is really true that if you go on the doorsteps as a politician, you'll find that very, 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 very large numbers of electors think that everyone else is crazy or stupid, but they're not. And blow me down, neither are their friends or their family. And actually, they're right about their friends and their family, and they're wrong about everybody else. On the whole, people are perfectly sensible. Of course, there are people that are not. But, and so if you sit a group of people down who have not had experience of governing, and you pose questions which involve them in actually considering the balance of things, they will tend to talk about these things in really quite sensible ways, and they will look at evidence and reasoned argument. Of course, they may be swept off their feet by somebody who gets into the mix who has that effect, but very often that doesn't happen. And actually, none of this should surprise us, because we've sponsored for many, many centuries the jury system. You said citizen juries, but we sponsor in the law courts the jury system. And it would be mad for us to have been doing this all this time if we didn't think that, by and large, if you sat 12 citizens down in a room and asked them the very tricky question, has this person done a particular thing which is criminal, which certainly requires reasoned argument and evidence and assertion and so on, and judgment, balance. We'd be mad if we did that, if we didn't think that actually 12 people in a room who are ordinary citizens would tend to come up with some sensible result. So I think there is a great deal to be said for this kind of deliberative assembly. And moreover, I think the spread of such activities would tend to lock into people's minds and into the political culture more sense of the value of argument and evidence. And that in itself would be valuable. But, and this is the bit where I'm pessimistic, these are the very reasons why the populists won't let that happen. If you've got a group of politicians who don't want those things to be governing, they won't institute such mechanisms. And in the end, deliberative mechanisms only survive as long as the group of politicians who are at any given time engaged in running the country let them survive. And you can see that from the example which I alluded to here, but which was really the origin of my thinking about this once I found myself out of politics, which was the profound shock I experienced when, as you recall, the judges were described as enemies of the people. Leave aside the subject, there's neither here nor there. But the idea that a group of Supreme Court judges sitting down to try to deliberate seriously and in legal terms about a constitutional issue, whatever view they came to, were coming to that view because they took a particular position about the people, is such a profound misunderstanding of the process of judicial action that it can't actually have been what the people who were accusing them of being enemies of people thought. What they meant was the judges were doing something which had a result that they didn't like. And therefore the institution of the judiciary was up the spout. Now, they didn't go so far as actually to disobey the law as decided by the Supreme Court, nor did they go so far as to get rid of the Supreme Court. But it indicated to me very clearly that, once you get to a certain point, you regard these institutions as themselves things that can be disregarded or attacked. And similarly, much more easily, you just don't create deliberative assemblies if you don't want reasoned argument to prevail. So while I think that it's a very useful device, I don't think it's a device which is going to save us from unreason if the politicians themselves, for some reason or other, get to the point where they're acting unreasonably.
Thanks. Any more questions? Probably got time for a couple more. Yeah, front.
So this was about economic policy. So you were Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer under Michael Howard. So just to give the idea of the politics of reason, do you think that economic policy is particularly susceptible to the politics of reason? Obviously, because it's about factual analysis and analysing the financial markets, it's easier to adjust to that side of politics. Whereas some areas of policy, for example, the Home Office or defence, I would say are more vulnerable to being captured by emotion and patriotism rather than intellectual ideas. What do you think of the idea that economic policy lends itself better to your idea about the political reason than other policy aspects?
Well, that's an interesting question too. I mean, I agree with you that economics is a powerful science. And so it's understandable that people might think that if people are engaging in economic decision-making, they will be guided by the procedures of science and hence by reasoned argument and evidenced assertion. But in the first place, economists, like any other set of scientists, are much better equipped to analyze things which have happened than to predict sufficiently well what will happen in the very near term. The analogy here is with weather forecasting. Weather forecasting is based on very well-established groups of science. So obviously, like all science, it's developing, but nevertheless, there's an awful lot of science there. And yet it's not terribly good at making predictions. Why not? Not because the science is feeble, but because the complexity of the real world is sufficient to make it very difficult to make those kinds of predictions. And that's exactly what afflicts economic science. So actually, policymakers, when they're engaged in economic policy, if they're wise, will certainly listen to the economists and understand the issues at stake, but they don't get answers from the economists that enable them simply to roll out a satisfactory conclusion. And the result is that actually it's perfectly possible to be completely unreasoning in applying economic policy. I don't think that there's any material difference, in fact, between that and any other department of governmental action, because I mean, you mentioned the Ministry of Defence, for example. Well, there's plenty of science that lies behind the actions of the Ministry of Defence, engineering and science, in plenty. But of course, there are judgments there that, as you rightly say, can be made rationally or irrationally. And I think actually the same is true in economic policy. And while we're at it, I mean, it's very interestingly, we've just been through a pandemic in which not economists, but medical scientists, epidemiologists and virologists and so on, who know an enormous amount, might have been thought to deliver in some automatic way rational evidence-based assertions about what was going to happen and therefore rational evidence-based policy making about how to deal with it. It didn't happen. Actually, the politicians were left in every country having to make it up as they went along because the understanding that the scientists were able to provide was largely after the fact rather than before it. And I think that's very typically the case. So I don't think there's any rescuing unreason in politics by a resort to science. Of course, if you don't pay the slightest attention to science, you are engaging in extreme unreason. And there's been some of that around too. I fear that President Trump did some of that, and we've seen some other world leaders or leaders in the world who sort of flatly deny scientific propositions for which there's no basis in denial. But once you get past that point, the scientists can't deliver you from the next stage, which is, are you going to actually make judgments which are sensible judgments after you've heard the scientists, because they can't deliver you with automatic answers.
Thank you. Any last questions? I have one, if I'm allowed to abuse my position. I just wondered quickly if you think your argument speaks to international politics in the same way that it does to domestic politics. I was sort of thinking about some of what you said in relation to thinking about populist leaders gathered together at COP26 although they're no doubt very strategic, very disingenuous in various ways, nonetheless engaging in quite a reasoned pursuit of the dual goal of the common good and getting ahead of the national interest, kind of all at the same time. I just wondered whether you think that the argument applies similarly, differently to international politics.
Well, that's a very interesting question too. I think it is true that that it's perhaps often and certainly sometimes the case that when political leaders find themselves having to engage as international statesmen, they become more like international statesmen and less like political leaders, and they do tend to, under those circumstances, abandon or diminish their sort of brand identity stuff and accentuate reasoned argument and evidenced assertion. But this is wafer thin for all sorts of reasons. First of all, they have to come home. And often enough, when they come home, it's not so good. And in fact, I think some of the most extreme forms of unreason in the whole long history of the world have been exhibited in the way that the wrong kinds of political actor have portrayed foreigners and relations to foreigners at home. The biggest brand is patriotism and the biggest identity is national, and it becomes very, very easy to talk about the foreigner as the enemy. Secondly, alas, the history of the world contains the most appalling examples of geopolitics going wrong to the extent of leading to things that no rational politician on either side could possibly have wanted to engender. It is impossible to construct a rational basis either in Britain or in Germany for the First World War. I mean, oddly enough, you can construct a rational basis for the Second World War, but you can't for the First World War. And yet it happened. And I fear we may be in a very similar position today in the growing conflict between America and China. I don't think that there are very many people, either in America or China, that want to have a war between the two, or if presented with the likely outcomes or even the possible range of outcomes of such a war, would find it appetizing. And yet, we may well be heading towards one. So I think the combination of the ease with which populist, unreasoning politics will slip into jingoism and nationalism, and the degree to which acquiring the habit of not considering likely ex post consequences and evidenced assertion can lead to gradually escalating conflict that is not in anybody's interest, is such that I don't think we should place any faith in the hope that geopolitics will be much better than national politics in this respect. In fact, I think it places at least as much of an onus on the character of politicians as national politics does, perhaps much more.
That seems like a somewhat depressing, but nonetheless probably appetite place to stop. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you all for your questions and such interesting responses. And can we finish off just by thanking Sir Oliver very much for his...